Welcome to Guys Open. Today on Guys Open, I have a grand guest, David Paulman. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Chris. I've been following your podcast for a little while, actually, so it's kind of an honor to be on.
Fantastic. And the best thing happened within the last, a couple months. Oh, there was a little bit of lag there. The best thing that happened with the last couple months is James White decided to come off his high perch and attack you. Fantastic. And so we've been getting a lot of joy out of that. The ribbing that James White has been getting for his stooping so low to attack you based on credentialism, which is actually what today's podcast is about. So today, you put on your Facebook wall, I'm going to read that real quick. You said, "There's no substitute for doing your own research. We are forced to rely on the research of others due to our own limitations, but this is a dependency born of necessity, not an ideal situation." Yeah, like for example, if I'm studying the early church fathers, it might be okay to consult someone who is like a scholar in Augustine and summarizes his work, but really, if you really want to understand him, you need to go read those actual references. You need to read the firsthand literature, the firsthand data to try to get an accurate summary. Because not all the time are people accurate. Not all the time are people meticulous. And a lot of times people are human and they could be missing stuff. So relying on others is somewhat of a necessity. But as you state here that when you do that, you inherit whatever flaws and weaknesses are present in their research. There's an epistemic gap between yourself and the evidence. The only way to close that gap is to be your own scholar. Can you close all the gaps? Unfortunately not. Can you make a concerted effort to close as many as possible? Absolutely. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your spat with James White, and your comment here about being your own researcher.
All right, let's see if I can remember those three requirements. So about me, I'm not a terribly interesting fellow, but I kind of have been in the apologetics world. I have a YouTube channel called Faith Because of Reason. I've been involved with the Society of Evangelical Arminians. I've been a member there for, I think, 4 to 5 years at this point. So I've been involved in the Calvinism debate, arguing against them, as have you. In terms of the James White debate, it started with a Facebook post that I made, basically just saying that I didn't think that Greg Bonson, who's kind of he's like a sacred cow in the Calvinist camp. He was this big presuppositional apologist in like the 80s and 90s, and I'm not a fan of presuppositional apologetics, and I just basically said I thought he was overrated, as are a lot of people in the Calvinist camp who are just kind of popular because they're good rhetoricians, like they speak well. Like James White, he's a great speaker. The guy has got a skill, but in terms of substance, he doesn't have a lot to offer. And that's just true of so many people in the that are like popular in the Calvinist camp. But that's not to say everyone. Like I get that there are serious Calvinist thinkers, but usually they're the more obscure ones that you don't hear about. And really, that was the only point I was making in the post, was like, just make sure there's substance behind whoever it is that you're listening to. Don't be taken in by because someone's a good speaker. And James White first he took a screenshot of my profile, and basically insinuated that because I worked at in retail at a clothing store called Dillard's, that meant that I wasn't entitled to an opinion on this topic. And a lot of people called him out on that, and so then he did a longer post later on where basically he said I was too young to have read Greg Bonson. I couldn't have, even if I did read him, I couldn't have understood him. And and then I did a book review of his book, The Potter's Freedom, with my friend Will Hess over on the Church Split, and he's been now responding to that book review.
A 3-second story. I was debating someone on Gnosticism, and they're like, "Have you ever read any Gnostic texts?" I'm like, here's a couple of links to YouTube of me just reading straight from the Gnostic texts. It was the most glorious thing in the world. But that reminds me of your thing. You do a book review right after he says, "Oh, this guy's never even read this." It's like, what? this is how disconnected from reality these people have to be, is that they just have to deny facts about reality to make their worldview fit. It can't be that you have genuine disagreements. You can't genuinely just understand him or genuinely understand Calvinism. No one could genuinely understand Calvinism. It all has to be dismissed out of hand. They can't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, the idea is like, well, if you understood it, then of course you would agree. So yes, there's no room for reasonable disagreement there with people like White, which is unfortunate, but that's the situation. I don't know if you want me to comment on the post, but just basically the point there that I was making was that there's kind of always a problem when you're relying on the research of other people. And I acknowledge we have to do it. Like, we can't master everything. But when you're doing that, any problems that are present in another person's research, if you're just accepting their research, then you get those problems as well. And so kind of the only way to close that gap, as I put it, is to actually do the research yourself. And so that was the mentality behind that post.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've discovered in my time on this earth is that credentialism is just credentialism. It doesn't necessarily represent the quality of an individual or the depth of their thinking. It represents how much time they've spent being institutionalized and passing certain tests. It doesn't even necessarily demand that they grasp the concepts being discussed. People get degrees all the time, and it's just by putting in the effort, like low intelligence individuals. I was debating with someone, it was a Calvinist, coincidentally, where I was saying, your ideas are basically Platonism. And they're like, we're philosophers. And Calvinism can't be Platonism because Plato was not a monotheist. I'm like, yeah, Plato was a monotheist. And they're like, no, he wasn't. He talked about the Greek gods here, here, and here. I'm like, look at those references. I don't see any Plato name. I see there's the Socrates or whatever. And then they go with this, they're freaking out like, oh, he was just writing by the name Socrates and he secretly believed in everything Socrates says and it's like, you guys have no understanding of the Platonic dialogues whatsoever. How the subtleties involved in what he's communicating and when he's communicating, and the depth of what he's talking about. You don't understand Parmenides and his discussion about the one, or his public lecture on the good, where everyone shows up to this lecture where they thought they're going to a lecture on what it means to be good, or what good things are, and then to get this treatise on the one, the ultimate deity, something like that. They're all confused because that's what he actually believed in, despite sometimes his characters in his text talking about various deities. So these people with a philosophical degree are trying to just demean me. Oh, Plato's not a monotheist. Well, Justin Martyr sure thought he was, and Justin Martyr was himself a Platonist. So you're telling me that actual legitimate Platonists who follow Plato, you understand Plato better than these people? Fantastic. Your degree is worth so much. I care so much about everything you learned and your contributions to this dialogue. A lot of these people with these degrees, they're not focused. So their studies aren't going to be focused in the particular topics, especially topics that they think they're qualified to discuss. If someone was just only focused on Plato and had a degree in that, where that's their primary study, I'm going to weigh that person's opinion more than someone with like a general degree, where they're not forced to deal with the intricacies, the evolving literature, the debates on the Plato's corpus. I'm going to trust those people with the focused degrees a little bit more than those general degrees.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, observe that we are not opposed to credentials per se. I mean, credentials are a fine thing to have, but specifically to credentialism, you don't have to have the credentials in order to have a relevant knowledge base. And that's, I think, especially true in, the case of someone like White, whose own credentials are somewhat suspect because
it kills him and eats him up inside. So he's like, I think he's working on like an accredited degree right now, and I think it's like all this insecurity, all these people saying you got a fake doctorate, and so I think it kills him inside, and so him attacking you might be his own personal insecurities. I'm just going to speculate just a little bit on that. It might be his own insecurities.
Yeah, I think it could very well be the case. You know, and again, it doesn't mean that White doesn't know what he's talking about just because his degree is, you know, from a diploma mill. But you know, I think his own work speaks for himself, or for itself, that he doesn't know what he's talking about on a lot of issues. But yeah, the point being that he doesn't even really have any room to talk about credentials or other people's lack thereof, because he himself is sort of lacking in that area.
Yeah, so I think what you said there is key. Is credentials themselves, you know, it kind of indicate someone's commitment to a field, but you really need to judge them based on what they've actually produced, what kind of work they've produced, the quality of that work, how sound those arguments are, what do they say, what are their arguments, and then you could engage in their arguments. Did you? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I got that. I was actually trying to look up a quote here, but I think I can say it from memory. I think it was from Tim McGrew, and he said that an advanced degree is indirect evidence that you know what you're talking about. It's helpful as far as it goes, but indirect evidence must give way in the face of direct evidence. Show me that you know what you're talking about, and I don't care whether you have a degree. Show me that you don't know what you're talking about, and I don't care whether you have a degree. And I think, you know, the point there was it's always got to be determined ultimately by, does the person show knowledge of the field in which they're speaking, not, you know, necessarily do they have an advanced degree in that field. Because, as you said, you know, degrees, some people can get them, and it's evident that they probably shouldn't have them, and especially so in the case of a very general, like just like a general liberal arts degree or something like that.
Brandon says you got Dillard credentials. Yeah, absolutely. And so guess what that means? It means he's got a lot of time. Every week you're posting a different stack of books you're reading. And so James White doesn't follow your Facebook account, but he'd probably see all these books that somehow you can afford, and somehow you're reading every single week with all this free time that apparently exists somewhere on this earth. So I would put your knowledge of random obscure philosophers well above James White or James White normal listeners. I just based on what I see you post on a weekly basis.
Well, James White also and his group tend to be very demeaning, I guess, towards the field of philosophy. Like they don't like it, and it's ironic because so many of their beliefs are very philosophical in nature. And that's not a bad thing, right? We all have philosophical beliefs, even if, you know, they're implicit, we're not, you know, consciously aware of them. We all have them. So I think it's just kind of funny when people like James White want to belittle people who are interested in philosophy or read philosophy and then act like they don't do it. But when you do exegesis, sorry, you're doing philosophy. There's no way around it.
The funniest part of the William Lane Craig debate with him was when James White's like, I'm just reading the Bible. And William Lane Craig's like, your evidence fits my belief system too. You have just a different philosophy, and the evidence fits both of ours. And then he got like real mad about that. He's like, "Arr!" And he's getting laughed at by William Lane Craig on the internet. It warmed my heart. It was so funny. I was just dying. But yeah. I did make a video because the problems that we're talking about now with credentialism, it's not just a problem with theology. It's problematic across the board in the sciences. I don't know if you've ever seen me talk to my PhD brother about credentialism and about the state of science and about the state of education, but there's a lot of systematic problems. And so I kind of got a video compilation of various fields, and we're going to start with something called the replication crisis and p hacking, and why most published studies are wrong. Have you ever heard of this, or have you ever heard anything like that?
I've heard that generally it's an issue in some fields, although the specific terminology you're bringing up there is not ringing any bells.
All right, so I'm going to hit play, and it's probably not going to go where we left off, so it's probably going to restart the intro. So I'll just hit play, and we'll see how this works.
Imagine you're a researcher in a field where there are 1,000 hypotheses currently being investigated. Let's assume that 10% of them reflect true relationships and the rest are false, but no one, of course, knows which are which. That's the whole point of doing the research. Now, assuming the experiments are pretty well designed, they should correctly identify around, say, 80 of the 100 true relationships. This is known as a statistical power of 80%. So 20 results are false negatives. Perhaps the sample size was too small or the measurements were not sensitive enough. Now consider that from those 900 false hypotheses, using a p-value of 0.05, 45 false hypotheses will be incorrectly considered true. As for the rest, they will be correctly identified as false, but most journals rarely publish null results. They make up just 10 to 30% of papers, depending on the field, which means that the papers that eventually get published will include 80 true positive results, 45 false positive results, and maybe 20 true negative results. Nearly a third of published results will be wrong even with the system working normally. Things get even worse if studies are underpowered, and analysis shows they typically are, if there is a higher ratio of false to true hypotheses being tested, or if the researchers are biased. All of this was pointed out in a 2005 paper entitled "Why Most Published Research is False."
So right here, we already have a crisis in science, is that peer-reviewed studies that are published, and you see the news headlines all the time, like, oh, coffee dehydrates you. And remember back in the day where they're pushing the food pyramid, and carbohydrates needs to be the base of our nutrition. Like, these types of things are not really true. Like, it turns out years later that the whole food pyramid is completely bogus, and it turns out that coffee doesn't actually dehydrate you. A lot of these studies get pushed out in the field that are actually false because of just the way science publishes papers. The peer review process works.
Yeah, and I think that there's also something to it that there kind of when you're in a field of study, then there's, I guess, a motivation to discover something that's new and different. And so that can, get people barking up the wrong tree, as it were, because they just want to discover something that's new and different. And, sometimes their drive can get in the way of their scholarship or their research. And so they'll, publish something prematurely. And so that's why, you'll later find out that, oh yeah, that was bogus.
I think I do have a clip. I think on the next clip I have is that guy talking about that very subject. So let's see what he says there.
Scientists have huge incentives to publish papers. In fact, their careers depend on it. As one scientist, Brian Nosek, puts it, there is no cost to getting things wrong. The cost is not getting them published. Journals are far more likely to publish results that reach statistical significance. So if a method of data analysis results in a p-value less than 0.05, then you're likely to go with that method. Publication's also more likely if the result is novel and unexpected. This encourages researchers to investigate more and more unlikely hypotheses, which further decreases the ratio of true to spurious relationships that are tested. Now, what about replication? Isn't science meant to self-correct by having other scientists replicate the findings of an initial discovery? In theory, yes, but in practice, it's more complicated. Like, take the precognition study from the start of this video. 3 researchers attempted to replicate one of those experiments, and what did they find? Well, surprise, surprise, the hit rate they obtained was not significantly different from chance. When they tried to publish their findings in the same journal as the original paper, they were rejected. The reason? The journal refuses to publish replication studies. So if you're a scientist, the successful strategy is clear. Don't even attempt replication studies because few journals will publish them. And there is a very good chance that your results won't be statistically significant anyway, in which case, instead of being able to convince colleagues of the lack of reproducibility of an effect, you will be accused of just not doing it right. So a far better approach is to test novel and unexpected hypotheses and then p-hack your way to a statistically significant result.
So p-hacking is the idea that when you're testing something out, you're testing not only one hypothesis, but a bunch of them. So the example he gives is if eating chocolate while you're on a diet leads to extra weight loss or better sleep or lower cholesterol. And so the more things you're testing for, the more likely you're going to get a significant result. So you're p-hacking it. It's not your error probability is not supposed to be meant for testing multiple hypotheses, and that value itself is arbitrary to begin with. So there's a lot of systematically corrupt things when it comes to studies, and then the studies that get published. And he talks quite a lot about incentivization. People are incentivized to put out things, even if those things are wrong, and not correct those things. They live or die based on it. Entire organizations live and die based on funding. Maybe they're a climate change organization working for the government, and their budget's directly linked to how alarmist the population is about climate studies. People have ulterior motives. Yeah, there's some people who are working on purely altruistic grounds, and there's some people who think that they're not being motivated by money, but a lot of times these types of things seep into the science, where the science is not pure, even if it's, let's say, a government employee.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of the file drawer effect that goes on, where I guess whatever's in line with the current trend, that's what gets pushed, and then whatever contradicts that, it tends to just get filed away.
Yeah, so David points out secondhand smoke. I wrote an article on smoking ban because when I was in college, that was their big push in the 90s and the early 2000s, was to ban smoking. And so you saw this coordinated public campaign against smokers. But if you pulled up the data, the cancer rates, that was one of their big selling points, is like, you're going to get cancer if you smoke. But if you pulled up the statistics from Greece, they had higher smoking rates than the U.S., but lower cancer rates. And the CDC, of course, said, oh, yeah, that's because they eat healthier. Well, why isn't that your solution for Americans? Just eat healthier. Why are you saying let's ban this? Why aren't we proactively telling people to go on a diet, eat more fruits, eat more vegetables, walk places, don't ride cars everywhere, get out and be active? That could do it could go pretty far in reducing our death rates. But you don't see the CDC doing that.
Yeah.
It's like COVID. One of the primary comorbidity is being overweight, but you don't see the CDC and people promoting healthy lifestyles, working out, getting your life together, not drinking soda every day. I got a pop here. Not drinking soda every day, working out, and just cardio. You don't see them doing that.
You ever notice how the messages get crossed sometimes too? Because you have, on the one hand, for example, saying that people who are obese or overweight, these people are the ones who are more susceptible to COVID. But at the same time, they're basically have a whole fat acceptance movement, and tell people they're just fine and don't judge them for being overweight and stuff. It's interesting how the messages sometimes just contradict each other.
I really feel like the rise of fat acceptance also was correlated to the decline in smoking, because smoking is an appetite suppressant. And so you're telling all these people not to smoke, and then people are getting fatter. And then you're basically saying, oh, you're not smoking. That's good. You're getting fat. Yeah, that's okay. Something like that. That's what it feels like happened in American society during my time in college, and then thereafter.
Right.
So I'm going to keep hitting play. Our next clip is going to be Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan's interviewing Lindsey James. And Lindsey James and a couple of his friends decided to write a bunch of fake papers for peer review publication. A whole bunch of them. And they got a ton of them published. So let's listen to them talk about that.
Let's explain what you guys did.
Yeah, so we started about a year and a half ago now. It was last summer. We started writing a bunch of academic papers for the journals that represent these fields. And so everybody understands what an academic paper is getting out of the gate. This isn't like an op-ed that you dash off for Washington Post or some magazine or whatever. This is a thing academics work their careers to write one or two of these a year.
Yeah.
And so they're really hard to write. They're supposed to be hard to get published. So we wrote 20 of them in 10 months. And 7 of those got accepted. 4 were actually published. And
then we got
at least
busted.
4 more. Yeah, we got busted. And
Yeah.
at least 4 more were on track. Maybe 5 or 6 more would have gotten in.
What's the difference between getting accepted and getting published?
So the process with everything in academia is really slow, and a lot of people don't know this. So you send off this article, The editor looks at it, and the editor either gives it the thumbs up or the thumbs down. If they give it the thumbs up, it goes off to peer reviewers, and that process takes months. Often as long as, we had one paper that was 8 months under peer review. So the reviewers look at it, they try to figure out if the arguments are good, they try to figure out if the research is good, they evaluate that, they give extensive comments, they send it back to you, then you have to revise it according to whatever they say, make it better is what's supposed to happen. They made ours crazier. And so then they did every single time.
We took the feedback and made the papers just the most extreme thing.
Most extreme things. And so then you send them back. So now you're probably 3-4 months in just to the review process, not to the writing, which should also take months.
Yeah.
And then the editor will either send it back to the reviewers to see if it was good enough, or they'll just evaluate it themselves depending on where it stands. And then they'll make a decision as to whether or not to accept it or reject it or ask for more revisions. And then when they accept it, that means the journal's ready to publish it. But then the publishing process requires all the typesetting, proofing, all the stuff that goes into making it professional for an academic journal. And that can take months.
And publishing is the coin of the realm. Like, that's it. So the ideal is one paper every year in the humanities broadly. So that's how you credential yourself, that's how you get tenure, which is a job for life. That's how you get to teach people these ideas who then, as you said, go out into the workforce, 5-6 years later and infect everybody with total silliness. So it's the gold standard peer review. So we saw a tremendous problem.
And so here's these guys just writing fake peer-reviewed papers with crazy ideas, just getting published left and right. And it feels to me like the lowest IQ people on the internet are the ones who are always demanding a peer review paper for everything. You got a peer review paper for that? As if the peer review is some sort of magic process that eliminates all bias and actually gives us a gold standard of truth. There is a video that I forgot to splice in where it's an actual scientist in the field, and he's doing field work as he's talking about the peer review process, complaining about millennials who demand peer review. I forgot to splice that into this video, but it's pretty interesting. So, peer review papers. Are you a big advocate after I've been condemning them?
I think that, the peer review process is helpful. So I think what we see in there is that it's helpful, but not perfect, right? So they had, I think you said 20 of these papers, right? And so of these 20 papers that should not have gotten published, right? 4 got through. So we see that, it helps weed out some of the craziness, but obviously it's not perfect. So I think we would have to be, obviously it's got to be determined by the content of the paper. It's not just like it's peer reviewed, so it's right. What that means is that, okay, there's been a vetting process. We've weeded out some of the craziness, but obviously weird stuff gets through because it's not a perfect process.
Yeah, they actually talk about this. Greg says, who are these guys? This is James Lindsay, and he's on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think all I did was Google James Lindsay dog paper on YouTube, and you could get that clip. But they were talking about the process, and originally when they started the project, their papers, none of them were going through. They had to actually add all sorts of craziness, and actually all these papers that they're submitting are about social justice in the social realm. And that was their intent, to expose this particular field of science as being bunk. And so they had to just talk to the narrative, talk about privilege, and just dive in. And those were the papers that started getting accepted. They started learning the process. They just had to dive into the social justice craziness head first. Just go for it. And then they started getting accepted.
Yeah, and like I said, it probably it depends on the field to some extent. So in social justice, it doesn't surprise me that you could get some crazier stuff in. I think in maybe some more rigorous fields, it would be more difficult to do that. But I think what it does show, again, is that a peer review process is certainly not perfect. It doesn't mean that what's being said is true or is, genuinely good research.
A provisionist says, I'm so glad Fisher doesn't have the SteamYard link anymore. It probably will come back. This is a month on this non free version, so we'll see how that works out. But let's see what our next clip is. I'm trying to remember. It's probably just, this is Arnold Klein. So Arnold Klein is the economist. We talked already about social science. We talked about just normal statistic papers. This is a post by Arnold Klein, economist, 2007, where he talks about the problem of intellectual inbreeding within the economics departments. He says at the very top departments, more than 90% of economists come from the worldwide top 35 departments. The top is almost entirely self-regenerating. So this is a problem, because what this means is that the economics field is very self-selecting. It doesn't have the wide diversity of thought that we'd hope it would have. And he talks about this down here, where the number of PhDs in economics is outnumbering the number of positions available in econ departments. And these econ departments are being staffed by the top PhD programs in these top departments. And so it's all inbreeding. It's all the same type of thought that's being propagated. And so you're going to find people like the Austrians. There was a news article. It's like, who saw this inflation coming? The U.S. is maybe at 10% inflation. The official numbers are about 7. House prices are about 30. I just ran an inflation calculator on the Coke. The Coke's doing pretty good. So if the Coke kept up with the official price calculator, it'd be 70 cents a can, but it's still around 30. So that's good. But our houses are up 30%. And so there's massive inflation. And all these experts have been informing Joe Biden, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, saying, you're not going to have these negative consequences. Go ahead and print whatever dollars. And all the Austrian economists and the Chicago School, they understand printing money causes inflation. And that's who saw this. Normal, rational economists who are not in this hegemony of thought. These PhD departments going out and propagating this nonsense that inflation is not going to happen if you just wildly print money.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, no, I don't know if you have any thoughts about economics, but that was, so my credentials is in college. I was a double major political science and computer science and math and econ minors. But I'm going to tell you right now, that my degree in computer science did not teach me anything new about computer science that I didn't know before. It literally was credentialism. Things that I had taught myself were reinforced at this class. Of course, it exposed me to Java before college. I only did C, C++, Visual Basics, Pascal, and I think one more type of language. But it did expose me to Java, but basically all the concepts were the same, and I didn't really learn anything new. Political science taught me a couple interesting things, but most of my political science knowledge came from before the credentials. The credentials really didn't add anything to my knowledge set because my knowledge set was self-created. It was already pretty thorough before I went into these programs.
Yeah, and I mean, a dedicated student, can, I think, learn a lot through their own studies. Considering my own studies, right, I think I honestly learned more just through, reading books on my own time than I have ever learned in a classroom. The advantage, I guess, I see in a degree program is, I guess, that sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so if if your instructor, your advisor, your dissertation advisor, they will know the territory better. So if you're missing something, they can point you towards it. So I think that's the key advantage I would see in that. But honestly, you can get just by having informed people around you, they can point out your own blind spots to you without necessarily having to, have gone through the academic process. So the idea that you have to go through that in order to, know a field well, I think that's certainly incorrect.
Yeah, Greg is pointing out a huge problem with the economics field. He says, I know a guy that has a master in econ. He's never heard of the Austrian School of Economics. I was talking to a guy with a degree. It was like a bachelor's or a master's from George Mason University. And he was literally arguing to me that inflation, but printing money doesn't cause inflation if it's put in, let's say, a luxury market. It's like, who taught you that? Whoever did should be fired. Your degree should be revoked. Everything you're saying is just absolute nonsense. And this guy's a guy with with real degrees from George Mason University. I'm assuming he's not lying to me. Maybe he's just lying to me. But the idea that you could just print money and not cause inflation without subsequently burning the same amount of money somewhere is just absolutely ridiculous to me.
Maybe he got his degree from the same place as James White, really.
Maybe. All right. So I think our thing is another image still. So I'll just kind of zoom forward. See how far it goes. Oh, this is about, I was reading American Spartan, and American Spartan is about a major during the Afghan War who lived a warrior lifestyle. He fought for the sake of fighting, and it talks very in detail about the entire Afghan ordeal. And this paragraph that I pulled out is about General Petraeus. The United States had 20 years in Afghanistan. We had the brightest minds in military. We had the brightest minds in government. We had all these advisors. We had all these government organizations and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, flying into Afghanistan, trying to remake Afghanistan, trying to change that population into a functioning democracy. 20 years later, we pull out, and a week later, the Taliban's in control, and everything's back to normal like it was before we even got there. 1 week to undo 20 years of our work. We had the brightest minds working at this. So just because people have experience in government, just because people have degrees like General Petraeus, just because people have experience in diplomacy and working with other people, doesn't mean that they know what they're doing. A lot of it is trial and error. A lot of it is misunderstanding human nature. And I think we get that a lot. People like to see other people as malleable. All you have to do is flip the right switches, and then you can force anyone into any mold you want. That's just not how people work. People are stubborn. People don't want to change. People have ingrained ideas that you're not going to dislodge. Foreign nation building is extremely hard with a group of people who are culturally diametrically opposed to what America is. Trying to turn them into a functioning democracy is not going to work. It was a failed attempt from the start. That these people with the right degrees, with the right credentials, they try to do this 20 years later. How many lives are gone because of this?
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for, the different types of tasks that are out there, right? So there are some issues where, being book smart, in kind of like a classroom setting, that's a good type of education to have for, whatever the task might be, but be that education, philosophy, maybe one of the more, armchair sorts of sciences, if you want to call them that. But when you're talking about something like developing a country or something like that, or agriculture, like there's a lot more hands-on experience that people need there. And so being book smart doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be capable for doing some of the more practical things. And so I think that that's an important point to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The major that they're talking about here, he was able to build rapport with the locals because he really was a warrior, and it's a warrior culture. And through his actions, he is able to inspire their loyalty and as a proxy, loyalty to the U.S. among these. I think it was some Shiite tribes that he was working with. I think the Sunnis were by and large the insurrectionists, and then you had some Shiite. It's a huge mess. The Afghan situation, a huge mess. I don't envy any of these people. But our next example is going to come from Bob Enyart. And of course, Bob Enyart's a young earth creationist. And this is going to be when I know you're not a young earth creationist. That was one of the views that you changed on at some point in your life. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would be an old Earth creationist. So I still reject theory of evolution, but I would hold to an old Earth. Yeah,
but this is going to be a clip. This is him talking to Jack Horner. Now, Jack Horner is the individual who Jurassic Park, that was based off him, that main character with the hat. That character was based off of Jack Horner. And of course, they found soft dinosaur tissue, and he called him up and he offers him $20,000 to carbon date this dinosaur tissue. And what happens is pretty surprising that this guy would say this publicly, but he basically says, and we'll hear him say it, that he refuses to carbon date it because it will give ammunition to the creationists. That's the reason he turned down $20,000. And I was arguing with an evolutionist about this, about evolution. I'm like, these people are not, they're pundits. They're just as human as you or I. They're people. And as for an example, Bob Enyart offered $20,000 grant, free money, to carbon date this dinosaur tissue, and they refused it on the grounds that it would give creationist ammunition. And he just denied that this happened. He just said, that never happened. You're making it up. It's like the audio's out, the phone call's out there. No one's denying this, but you have a worldview in which this has to be the case, because in your worldview, science is pure. People don't have ideology. People are not ideological motivated, and everyone's in it to try to get the most pure data and scientific results. That's just not the case. There's a lot of politics that go into science. So I'll just hit play. I wonder how long that's going to go.
A test like this would just
Okay, so here we go.
just add another bit of scientific information that you would have at your disposal. And also, in that grant letter, we asked if it could be a blind test with 5 different specimens, and therefore then the museum could test 4 other specimens that you might want to have carbon-14 dated, and so you could put it all in the same batch, and those testing then will pay the cost of that. That'll be free to the museum plus the $10,000 grant.
Let me tell you where I'm coming from here.
Sure.
All right. Obviously, your group is a group of creationists,
Yes.
and the spin they can get off of it,
Right.
doing it, is
Well,
not going to help. Not going to help us.
Yeah. So even though it's just a scientific test, they're not
Well,
asking for
it's
voodoo
not
or anything.
It's not actually a scientific test. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Carbon-14 dating something with soft tissue in it. Jack, if I could raise $20,000, would it be worth?
I will talk to Mary Schweitzer about it.
Okay. I appreciate that. And how about this? I'll resend you the grant letter with the amount of $20,000 in it. And then you could talk to Mary and we'll see where it goes.
I want to know what group is sponsoring it.
Okay.
Mhm.
It's
I mean I need some really specific details about.
Sure.
And don't just tell it to me straight.
Of
okay.
course.
And so here you have an individual. He doesn't think it's a scientific test, not because he denies carbon-14 dating, but because he believes that the carbon-14 dating results is not going to give them any useful information, because, of course, in his mind, the specimen is going to be well over 100,000 years old, which that's it. That's where he's starting. Bob Enyart's contention is that the specimen is under 100,000 years. And so the carbon-14 dating will give some sort of results.
Yeah, and though I'm not a young Earth creationist, I'm not hostile to the movement, and so I do think that there are some interesting arguments in favor of young Earth creationism, and that it should be discussed. And so I wouldn't be the guy to say that there's no evidence for it. I would just say I think that the total weight of evidence reigns against it. But yes, in this kind of case, where it seems like you've got people trying to not do scientific research because they don't like where it could go, that's definitely like an unacceptable and even dishonest way of conducting oneself.
Yeah, so this guy's the gold standard of archaeology. He's the gold standard. He's got Hollywood movies about him, and this is his level of anti-science. We'll say he has some personal biases that are fairly evident, and he'd readily admit to them in a phone conversation. So it is interesting. The interesting thing is that the creationists did get a hold of dinosaur bones. Not all dinosaur bones are fossilized. They did do the carbon dating, and then they presented those results. The bones were dating more like 40,000 years, which that they shouldn't have any carbon in them. If they're over 100,000 years, it should be undetectable. But not contamination, because the results are fairly consistent no matter where you're testing a bone. So if it's going to be contamination, it would be like pockets of carbon here, pockets of carbon there. It wouldn't be a consistent carbon. So they presented, there's a group that presented these findings and then got kicked out of a conference. I got the audio where Bob Enyart's talking to one of these carbon-14 experts talking about the dinosaur bone dating and getting kicked out of a conference not because they found anything wrong with what they're presenting, but because they didn't like the implications.
Yeah.
But just for the sake of the audience, this was a presentation at a geophysical conference in Singapore last summer, and they did carbon dating on the bones of 10 dinosaurs from around the world, different respected labs, and they found significant quantities of radiocarbon, that is carbon-14, which should only last thousands of years, not millions. This is a significant find, and it seems to be a consistent find.
That's correct. And the people who ran the conference took it out of the schedule after it had been presented because they said there's something wrong with the data, even though they didn't know what it was that was wrong, or in fact, if anything was wrong. But it just conflicted with their view of how old things should be. And so obviously it had to be wrong because it had the wrong perspective. But of course, if the question is, well, what perspective should we choose, then ruling it out of court to begin with is an improper procedure.
And this was a conference sponsored in part by the American Geophysical Union. And from another interview I did with one of these scientists on this team, the president of the AGU went to the hotel room of one of the presenters at a different conference in San Francisco and basically sat and received the presentation privately. You know, the data, what they've done here is they removed it from the program rather than attempt to respond to the data.
That's correct.
All right.
Now, to move on, the point that you make that since carbon-14 is everywhere, it can't be an anomaly. You know, at a certain point, this is a massive anomaly, or it actually starts becoming expected, and then you have to explain it not as just something weird, but as something that challenges your theory. And I think it's starting to get to the point where that's what's going on, which is, of course, I think why the people who ran the American Geophysical Union meeting decided to take it out of the meeting, because it's easier not to deal with it if it's not officially true. But this is an important point. The peer-reviewed literature is not always quite what it's cracked up to be because there's a filter in the way.
And so he's talking again about peer-reviewed literature. A lot of times, you know, sometimes the organization has no choice but to censor, because if you platform a divergent view, it looks like it's endorsement of it, and individuals will try to cancel you for that platforming. I don't know if you've noticed this in the modern world, that there's a thing called cancel culture, and they'll try to destroy you, even if you just take a picture with the wrong individual.
Yeah, and you know, the thing about peer review is this is, you know, a review by other people, right, who have their own particular views on things. And so if you're it's one reason it's kind of hard to get unpopular views put forward, because it's hard to get people to approve that. It's hard to get peers to approve that, the people who are doing the reviewing, if they're already hostile to the idea that's being put forward. So like I said, I think peer review, it's helpful as a filter, but again, it's not infallible, because like any filter, even a peer review filter can get clogged.
Yeah, so I think my last example is going to be in the field of archaeology. And it might be a little bit longer of a clip.
And so people like...
This is an interview with Stone Age herbalist and Bronze Age pervert, of course, the most scientific of names. But they're talking about the state of archaeology and the revolutionary field of genetics, how genetics is revolutionizing archaeology in a way that academia does not like, to such an extent that people are disclaiming their own papers. They're pulling their names off of papers that might give the non-politically correct view about population genetics. And so
Cassina had this idea that the Indo-European.
So he's going to start with this individual named Cassina, which was the traditional view, and he's going to kind of explain it. But the idea is that most of culture can be explained by vast movements of civilization and conquest, that the pots stick with the people. And that was replaced with this idea in archaeology that pots just kind of migrate out. People are like, oh, that's a cool pot, and then they start making that pot, rather than migrating with a forceful militaristic society. But genetic studies are showing that there have been huge population replacements, and this Cassina guy was actually correct in his original hypotheses. All right, did it stop on me?
Indo-European languages spread through migration and through invasion.
Yes.
And you could trace this through the material culture, that the Indo-Europeans had moved from one place into another and had come to dominate Europe, which is why we all speak Indo-European languages. And this was basically the case up until the post-war era, when you had a total rejection of this premise, and this wasn't just, oh, we don't like this theory. This was everything about culture history from the ground up was dismantled and rejected. The idea that that material culture could be bound to one place in time, that it could be specifically tied to one group of people, and so far it went so far as to basically reject that migrations and invasions were ever really a historical force. So if you look at sort of 1960s archaeologists, they basically dismiss the idea of invasions and migrations altogether. So if you've ever taken an undergraduate course in archaeology, you often get this refrain: pots are not people. Pots are not people. So if you get pots in one place, it doesn't mean that people brought them. Pots are just, they have a life force of their own, and they diffuse outwards. They just magically appear.
Yeah, any pause like that,
well, let's take it back, I suppose. We fast forward to the development of population genetics, and that has really, this is why I called my article kind of Broken Open. It's really just blown apart this consensus. It's very interesting, the reaction. So if you dive into the Hark paper, you have geneticists like David Reich, and they were, even before the paper was published, you had 3 or 4 of their co-authors remove their names from the paper and say they wanted nothing to do with this paper because, and they specifically cited Cassina as the culture theorist. They specifically said, if we publish this, we are validating these older theories, and we can't do that. So he had to write, I think it was 120-page appendix to attach to the paper, basically saying that he wasn't defending Cassina's position, and that's about, I don't know, 10 times longer than the actual paper itself. But nonetheless, you had so many archaeologists absolutely terrified by this kind of this re-emergence, and one paper actually called it Cassina's smile, as the revenge of Cassina. Not really. You have to attach a confessional saying that you don't approve of certain uses of these ideas. So yeah, it's definitely, it's in that ballpark. But it gets more insane because you have these papers, and they've started to come out thick and fast now about how there needs to be a clampdown on commercial genetics testing, on how we should stop publishing things like eye color and skin color in papers, that we shouldn't be doing that anymore because it's fueling the wrong type of interest in their papers. And so this is just I see I see a great clampdown, or I see an attempt at a clampdown coming on genetics, where you have people saying, you can't list ethnicity of the participants, for instance, it won't just neuter it. That will just abolish the idea of population genetics altogether. And
so the point of pulling all this up is all these fields are highly politicized. You have massive biases. In genetics, they don't like racists. Racists are really the people who are very interested in genetic studies. And so you have all these scientists, and they're like, uh-oh, the people who really love my stuff are all these racist people. And so, like, all their papers have to, like, decry racism, and then they have to dance around that because they don't like the implications of their own work. And so all these fields that we talked about, economics, biology, archaeology, even just normal data, just the way the data is presented with the p-values and p-hacking, all of it has systematic corruption and problems with it. And so I think the smarter attitude is be able to do your own research, be able to crunch your own data, be able to understand numbers, be able to understand statistical anomalies, what statistics actually mean, and how people use statistics in bad ways. I read Tammy Bruce's book. I don't know if you know who Tammy Bruce is, but she was a feminist back in like the 80s. But she was giving like domestic violence against women, and she was listening to one of her own advertisements on the radio where they came on and they said, men account for 2/3 of domestic violence recipients or something like that. And she was very mad in the way the data was presented. So she called up the radio station and said, no, you need to say that 1/3 of all domestic abuse is against women, because it makes women the victim rather than men, just in the way the data is presented. Because, of course, she had an agenda, and her agenda is women need to be the victim. We need to feel sympathy for women. It doesn't matter if men make up the majority of domestic violence or the majority of rape, as it is in this country, with prison stats. And so it's all about manipulation. There's all these biases. There's all these internal conflicts. There's just systematic corruption in the data. And so I think what you wrote originally on your page is incredibly insightful. We need to start doing research for ourselves. We need to dive into, if you're doing theology, dive into the masters, dive into the original works of the church fathers, dive into ancient Near East literature if you care about their worldviews and how they see things. Dive into Second Temple literature, or maybe even the Dead Sea Scrolls and all the non-canonical literature to kind of understand the worldview at those times. Just don't take someone's word for it. Or if you do, trust but verify. Is that your idea? Trust but verify?
Yeah, I said in the post, right, that obviously we can't master everything, right? There's a lot of evidence out there. You got to pick and choose your own fields. So, I mean, relying on experts, there's places where you have to do it. It's generally better to rely on experts than, disreputable people, because there is some kind of a vetting process, but it's an imperfect vetting process. And so, yes, it's better, if possible, where you can, be your own scholar, do your own research for yourself. That's really the only way to have kind of the close link to the truth, which I would hope that we would all want. And so, yeah, that was the heart of the post.
Yeah, so Patrick writes a question. He says, I don't understand why this pot idea is such a big deal. Why are people emotionally invested in how a pot got somewhere? It's just like IQ studies. People don't like IQ studies because it gives us some sort of metric where we could say one person's better than another. Again, I don't think so. A high IQ person is just as valuable as a low IQ person. They're both unique imagers of God. They both have individual value, but people intuitively see someone with a higher IQ as being better of a person. And so with these cultures, if one culture is dominant and goes in and sweeps out another culture, if the Aryans come in from the steppes of Europe and sweep through Europe and conquer everyone, then you could, if you're ranking cultures, ranking civilizations, you could say, oh, they're objectively better than the people they conquered. Case in point, they conquered them and replaced them. And so people don't like this hierarchy, any hierarchies in which you can say one group of people is better than another. Again, all of that is subjective. I personally don't think the culture who could kill the most of the other culture is the superior culture. I don't think that's a good metric, but some people do. And the people who really hate this idea of cultural migration, those people do value those things. They think in those terms.
Yeah, it's important, of course, remember that everyone is distinct, right? There are differences among people, and unfortunately, people will try to, seize upon that to try to say that some people are better than others. And the fact of the matter is we're better than other people at some things, and they are better than us in other areas. And so, we're all valuable because God has made us that way. But, we have different talents and stuff. It's important to acknowledge that. But again, like you said, keep things in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Imagers of God are valuable, whether or not they have someone with Down syndrome is a valuable human being. They're precious in God's eyes, and they have intrinsic internal value. And so I absolutely endorse those ideas. But what we do see in scholarly circles is this credentialism not bearing what the culture thinks of it. Like if you go talk to your random person, you pull them out at the mall and say, hey, this PhD guy said this, they'll probably be like, oh, he's got a PhD. He's pretty smart. So I guess that sounds about right. They put a lot of stock in someone's credentials. Someone gets up to tell you all about COVID on TV. Oh, he's got a doctor before his name. What he says must be true, regardless of the data, even if it contradicts what he said 1 week ago.
Yeah. Credentials are not a sign of infallibility by any means.
And so arguments need to be evaluated not based on who's saying the argument, but based on the internal structure of the argument, the syntax of the argument, the evidence for that argument. James White just giving we were just on that thread. We were just on that thread where some guy said that James White refuted you. And when a Calvinist says that James White or another Calvinist has refuted someone, what they really mean is James White or whatever Calvinist read the argument and just gave a monologue that was like a paragraph. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that he actually dived into your argument and took apart your argument and showed why you're wrong and another person's right. They have talking points, and as long as they feel that they've hit their talking point, they think that they've refuted someone.
Yeah, I mean, this has been like the substance of James White's response, right? It's like he'll play part of like the review of the book, right? And like someone will mispronounce a name, and he'll harp on that and say, yeah, that discredits us and how we don't mean anything. And he'll just ignore the complete argument that we were making because, a name got mispronounced. And it's like, that's not refuting someone. That's called bringing up a red herring, bringing up something that's irrelevant so that you can like go after that. And it doesn't even, address the argument, which is why I said, no, James White has not refuted me. He's basically ignored the real argument.
Yeah, so like, for example, my Isaiah 40 through 48 debate, I was debating a Calvinist, very nice guy, Daniel Madden, and I was talking about, in the text, God is counting. It says God counts the waters in his hands. And his response was, no, God doesn't actually count. He's just the measure by which all things are created or something. It's like, you didn't say why that text can't be what I just said. You just built a different narrative about the text. What within the context of those verses makes you believe that Isaiah has your ideas in mind? There's nothing there about like God being this. It's a talking point to this weird narrative about the verse without actually addressing why what I said was false. It's like if they present a counter narrative, then apparently my narrative is to be rejected and theirs is the true one. And theirs is so anti-intuitive. It's just like, what are you? Nobody would read this text and come to your conclusion about what's going on here. That's where are you getting this?
Yeah, I remember. I think I hosted. I was one of the co-hosts of that debate, if I remember correctly.
Did we pause there for a second?
Did we?
But I thought that was really funny. So he's like, yeah, Isaiah has a secret narrative. Well, of course, Isaiah throughout Isaiah 40 through 48, Isaiah's just like, yep, God teaches, God learns, God reacts to new events, God listens to prayers, God gets angry and frustrated. Yep, Isaiah writes all that, but he secretly had in mind this dualistic thing where he's talking in baby talk for us, and all his Calvinist metaphysics were still intact. I'm like, I don't. That's not in the text anywhere. I guess you could say that, but it's just not. You're just talking about the text. I don't see anywhere that shows it's true. Just talking about something does not mean you addressed it or proved your assertions.
Yeah.
A claim is not evidence.
Right. What can be asserted without evidence can be rejected without evidence.
Yeah, Patrick says this. I've noticed this. I want to discuss a point with Calvinists. They say X, and I present a counter argument, and they say X again, like their assertion is just self-evident.
Or
and so
they'll quote a famous Calvinist in support of it, like that's proof of it.
It's like, have you ever heard of A.W. Pink? Let me give you one of his rambling sermons with just allusions to Spurgeon. It's like, I don't care about what Spurgeon said. Well, why am I putting any stock in this guy? Is what he says accurate? Maybe. I feel like internally, this is what convinced them of Calvinism. And so they think it's going to work on you. It's like, I read Spurgeon and look at the structure that he said this in. Isn't that pretty nice? Isn't that, but no. Oh, okay. I guess we could close about there. We're just over an hour, and I thank you for joining me. Do you have any closing thoughts or closing words for the audience?
No. Just want to say thanks again for having me on. Appreciate the perspective that you have over here, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you. I think all the examples I grabbed today was just what I thought between when you posted this 8 hours ago and like right before the podcast. And so there's many more examples of corruption in science. These are just the ones that were on the top of my head that I could rally up in like one day. But there are more. People are fallible. People are humans. People have biases. People have agendas. When people are talking to you, you got to wonder, what are they trying to do? What's their goal here? What do they gain? What are they trying to prove? Where are they coming from? What's at stake? If Jack Horner came out as a creationist, he'd lose his entire job. He'd lose everything. He probably has a pretty good incentive not to be a creationist. Maybe just not saying creationism is correct, but he probably has a very strong social incentive to continue on with what he's doing. James White as well. James White would lose absolutely everything if he came out as not a Calvinist. He changed his mind, became an Arminian. He'd go broke. No one would listen to him anymore. He's burned all his bridges too, so it can't be like one of those conversion things where it's like, I was a former Calvinist. He's burned all his bridges. It would not. There's a lot of social pressure.
Yeah, and I think just beyond, obviously like social and financial things, I think just James White's ego would just never let him admit that he was wrong about. I mean, I've never heard him admit to be wrong about like a little thing. He's not going to admit that he's wrong about like the foundation of his entire career.
Yeah, that's a debate tactic. Never give an inch on any issue ever. And that's one thing he does. And it's one thing in his debate with John Sanders. John Sanders gives inches everywhere. John Sanders is like, yeah, that could be true. It could be this as well. He thinks he's in a normal discussion. He's not in a normal discussion. You're not interacting with someone who wants to think things out with you. You're in a discussion with a rabid wolf who wants to destroy you at all costs. You're not there for the same reason.
And that's why James White, James White is good, like I said, at debate and at rhetoric. That's why he likes the live debates, and that's what he pushes for. Because the man is not, engaging with like the best defenders of open theism or the best defenders of Arminianism in the literature. He doesn't go there. He tries to keep things in, because he'll get eaten alive if he tries to, actually engage these people in writing, which is what, the scholars are used to doing. If he just wants to get them to where he can like basically roll over them by, using his personality there. And I think that's, it's not wrong to play to your strengths, but it's just pretty obvious that that's what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. And thanks everyone in the comments. If you have any further comments or questions, put that down below or start a thread in the God is Open Facebook page. Thank you for listening.